Hi, I'm in Carmen, Manitoba. I'm here with Kim Brown with Manitoba Agriculture. We're at the Manitoba Agriculture building in Carmen. Kim, there's plenty of snow outside right now, but soon weeds are going to be on some of farmers' mind in a couple of months. And it came to mind, what are some of the preceding weed techniques that farmers are looking at come spring, and what should they be looking for?
Well, weed control first thing in the spring is so important. It's one of the things to get a good jump on the weeds. I guess weed control really starts the year before at harvest. You know, at harvest time, we're kind of seeing what weeds are still on the field, what annual weeds we're allowed to set seed. Are there perennials that would be coming back? Do we know a little bit later in the fall? Is there some winter annuals that start showing up? So first thing in the spring, you know, we could have anything out there coming up. We could have some perennials that are starting to regrow. We could have some winter annuals that are regrowing as well. And then, of course, we have our annuals coming from seeds. So you could have a mixed bag depending on the spring and depending how soon the snow goes and when it warms up. You know, we can see weed growth very early in the spring, or sometimes in some drier years, it's quite a while before we see things really start to green up. So I guess good government answer, it kind of depends. And we don't know yet, but this is a really good time to start planning and, you know, the what if. You know, what if this happens? What if that happens? What's my plan?
Something we talked about earlier before was the type of crop that a farmer may have had the previous year may dictate as well the type of weeds they might see coming up in their soil. So how does that affect things?
Yeah, exactly. Something like corn or soybeans, which are very late season crops, so they're taken off quite late. So, you know, the weed control following harvest of those crops can be very different. Something like corn, usually we do see a ton of tillage after that to deal with residue. So that affects the kind of weeds that might be coming up next year, or if there's any perennials or winter annuals, you know, on that field. So a lot of it, again, begins the year before at harvest time and looking at that, what's in that field at that time, and knowing what weeds were there. You know, lots of times, though, when we alternate our broadleaf crops with our grass crops type of thing, you know, we do see changes in weed spectrum from crop to crop, but kind of knowing what was there the year before, what we could be facing this spring, that will depend on what we saw in the previous season.
Okay. Are there any particular herbicides that are more effective at that time of year compared to other times of year, say in the fall?
I'm really a fan of layering approaches for your weed control. So, you know, we talk about first thing in the spring, we do a pre-seed burn off. And a lot of time when we talk about burn off, that's products that don't have any residual in them. They just burn off the weeds that are there. They get a nice clean field for us to start in and for our crops to start, you know, so that they're not already behind the 8 ball when it comes to weed competition. But we do also have a lot of products that are what we call pre-emerge, and they can go down in the fall. They can go down late in the fall. They don't really work on weed control in the fall at that time, but they're there for the spring to start going first thing in the spring, or they can go first thing in the spring as well. So when we're talking, you know, our first crack at weed control, it's either a burn-off product or hopefully a pre-emerge product that has some residual. Ideally, I'd like to see everybody using both. The pre-emerge products that have residual, some of it is 6 to 8 weeks of residual, sometimes it's a couple of weeks, but at least it gives you a bit more time to work on those weeds as they're emerging from seed, and then coupling that with a burn-off product, which, you know, that would be in the spring once the weeds are actually starting to grow. So that's going to depend on what crop you're growing, you know, which products we can use, what weeds are already up. So that's kind of a very reactive approach for picking some products, whereas doing a pre-emerge product is very proactive. You're assuming there's going to be certain weeds there. You know which products you can use in the crops you're planning to grow, and you put those products on early, either in the fall, so that they're there first thing in the spring, or very early in the spring so that they start working right away. Okay. So there's a couple of approaches there.
Right. And I guess as well, not so much even the crop you may have had previous year, but the crop you're growing this year could dictate how competitive that crop may be against weeds. So maybe there's a bit of leeway there?
For sure. I mean, usually we look at our crops like our cereals and our canola. Those are cool season crops, so we can put those in the ground fairly early. You know, canola we put in the ground a bit later, but our cereals, we try to get those in the ground very, very quickly. And there's some ultra early seeding going on, you know, with some work being done out west, and there's some really great research there showing that it can go in very early. The problem with putting some of the crops in really early is that they do take a while to get going. So we can have weeds growing during that time. And two, when people are putting crops in super early, lots of times they don't feel there's time for a burn off or a need for a burn off. And so sometimes we do skip that burn off when our crops go in really early. But we are putting the crops into cold ground. They do take a while to get going and going well. But generally, when we get those cool season crops in fairly early, things like wheat and canola, they have a lot lot of plants on an acre. They cover the ground, they come up pretty quick, they cover the ground pretty quick, and they're just more competitive against weeds because of that. We have other crops like soybeans or dry beans or corn or sunflowers that there's just a lot less plants per acre, and they're slower. There's a lot of bare ground for a long time, and they're not as competitive. They do eventually, for most crops, most of those crops get competitive, but it takes a long time. So your weed control has to be top notch until the crop gets to that point, because you have a lot more bare ground and a lot more time for weeds to emerge and take hold and become more competitive than the crop that they're in.
Right. One thing I think I've heard from your colleague John Gavlosky when it comes to insects is scouting. So scouting for weeds is probably not a bad idea to see what's actually in your field, so you're knowing how to approach them.
Right, right. And again, I think it's got to start in the fall. Some of our weeds, some of our annual weeds can still emerge year round and try to set seed before harvest, but usually our annual weeds that we're dealing with they're done by harvest, they've set seed. So if you had an idea what was there, that gives you a good idea what could be coming up. But our winter annuals, our perennials, that type of thing. So knowing what was on the ground last fall, and then first thing in the spring, just scouting and, watching for those green patches coming up and watching for the weeds that are coming up, and knowing that some of the early, some of our cool season weeds are going to be the first ones up, our cereals. Unfortunately, kochia comes up early. It's a warm season plant, but it does come up really early for warm season. And then just kind of having an idea of when some of these weeds could start to be appearing and watching for them and making sure we've got a plan for when they show up.
Okay. So with May about 3 months away where we are right now, what advice might you have for farmers once May comes around when it comes to pre-seed weed control?
Well, right now I know guys are looking at planning, and I'm sure that they have an idea what crops they're growing and possibly, the chemistry that they're going to be using. I would still be, really taking a look at that right now and planning for extra passes if you could. I know it's a really difficult year financially.
Sure.
The outlook is not great for a lot of the crops, and it's a much more challenging year that way. So we have to be careful with all input costs. But to have that plan right now, like if we start seeing these weeds, this is my plan. If I see those weeds, if we have to change cropping intentions, then how are we changing our weed control program? But we should have that weed control program pretty much set, but a contingency plan for what if something else shows up, or what if something goes wrong, or what if we have a really, really dry spring and I don't see a lot of these weeds coming up? What if we have a really wet spring and we've got late seeding, and seeding will take priority, almost always takes priority over things like burn off.
Exactly.
You've got to get the crop in the ground. It's got to get growing. So we have plans, but plans change all the time. So to have a backup, like if my plans change, then what am I going to do to make sure that I can stick to that weed control plan or adapt a weed control plan so that we can still get those weeds? At the end of the day, we don't want weeds to be growing and being competitive and causing yield loss, but we also don't want those weeds to be sticking around and setting seed. We have more and more issues with resistant weeds all the time, and so letting any weed go to seed is not a good idea, but trying to make sure we've got a plan to get those weeds out of there so that they don't hurt our crop as much. They don't take light and nutrients and water, but they also don't get a chance to set seed and cause problems for years down the road.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Kim. Thanks. Great seeing you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.